I'm so grateful that you all braved our strange spring snow to make it here tonight. My name is Dr. Jessica Joustra, and I serve here at Redeemer as the director of our Wolters Centre for Christian Scholarship. I'm just so grateful that you all are joining us here today at Redeemer University for our last installment of our Wolters Centre lecture series for the 2023-24 academic year, our lecture in the natural sciences and mathematics. Welcome. Here at Redeemer, we confidently proclaim that God's work in the world, in his original creation, in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, in God's coming restoration, is a comprehensive one. It's one that reaches every nook and cranny of creation. It is, to use the words of one of my favorite theologians, Herman Bavinck, it's a joyful tiding, not only for the individual person, but for humanity, for the family, for the state, for society, for art, for science, for the entire cosmos, for the whole groaning creation. And these lectures, these Wolters Centre lectures, are just one part of the work that our center is doing and Redeemer is doing in proclaiming and excavating and applying that good message. These lectures and the work of the center as a whole seek to faithfully steward the good gifts of the tradition upon which Redeemer stands, one that's been handed down from one generation to the next, and has important insights for living faithfully in God's good created world. And so in all our work here, including the work of these lectures, we want to excavate and explore the way the gospel pulls us, calls us, fashions us, directs us towards God's will and way in his world. So we ask questions like, what does it look like to witness to the lordship of Christ and his coming kingdom in all of our scholarship and study? How do we affirm the ongoing good in God's world while rejecting the distortions and twistings of sin? How does our Christian proclamation of who God is and how God created the world affect how we think about any and every discipline? One of the gifts of the center is thoughtful, reformed Christian scholarship that seeks to faithfully and directly answer these questions in and with all the disciplines of our university. We have in-house faithful teachers and scholars serving as our fellows who, in lectures like these in particular, join with leading scholars outside of Redeemer to help us think through central, vexing, and difficult questions of our day. So that's what we're here to do, to drill down into particular disciplines today, natural sciences and mathematics, and unpack some of the insights that a reformed approach to the challenges and questions of our day can bring with wonderful guides. Thinkers who can speak thoughtfully and insightfully to this tradition and apply the insights of this tradition to pressing issues and questions of our day. And so with such a vision, I'm delighted to introduce you tonight to our Wolters lecturer in the natural sciences and mathematics, Dr. Lydia Jaeger. Dr. Jaeger is a lecturer and academic advisor at the Nogent Bible Institute in France. And alongside this work, she holds research positions at a number of institutions like St. Edmund's College at the University of Cambridge, the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, and the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology. Perhaps in these appointments or in the title of our lecture tonight, you have a sense of what she does. Her work focuses on the relationship between science, theology, and philosophy. And she does this, we've seen it, just a taste of it here today, in a marvelous way, calling us to attend to God's good word to us in both his world and in his word. She's the author of many books, but I want to highlight two this evening, and one of them I'll note if you're an alumni, our alumni office has a special gift for you, including one of these books. You can scan a QR code in the back. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but maybe you are, and if you are, you can scan it and receive a gift from them. So I want to highlight two books. One of them, if you're an alumni, please accept that gift from our office. What the Heavens Declare, and then her latest book, Ordinary Splendor, which very thankfully has been just translated into English and was recently a finalist in Christianity Today's Best Book of the Year awards. In her work, she provides a sophisticated, wise, and deeply practical investigation into some of the very pressing questions we think about in the relationship between science and faith. And she does so explicitly drawing on the riches of the Calvinist and Neo-Calvinist tradition. This evening, we have the privilege of hearing her speak on one of those central vexing questions. How much control do we really have? Do we, as the saying often goes, did our genes make us do it? Or are we free? How might we construct a non-reductionistic view of humanity and our freedom in light of what God has revealed in his word and world? And in such an exploration, I'm delighted to have us see together the wonderful ways that Dr. Jaeger helps us understand and imagine how we bring science, theology, and philosophy together for a rich conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaeger for her lecture, Are We Free? Navigating Between Scientific Determinism and the Liberty of Creation.
Thank you for this very warm welcome, and thank you for the time I've already spent at Redeemer. I'm thankful for the week I can spend here. So, human freedom between scientific determinism and liberty of creation. Western civilization has been dominated for over 300 years by science. Whoever speaks about free will in this context today is confronted with a paradox. On the one hand, we experience ourselves of having free will, of being able, at least in some circumstances, to decide for ourselves which course of action to take. On the other hand, the scientific vision of humans sees them as determined by a set of scientifically describable factors. Concepts such as freedom of action, moral responsibility, openness to transcendence do not find a home in such a view. Biochemical or genetic neural hormonal causalities seem to be sufficient to describe the functioning of the body, and neuroscience increasingly reveals the physiological bodily existence of cognitive faculties which were formerly held to be the prerogative of the soul, as for example, thought, moral choice-making, or spirituality. Psychology and sociology bring out unconscious factors which guide our choices. Therefore, our awareness of being humans and not just animals, or worse, machines, seems to be a collective illusion, which, although useful and perhaps even necessary, remains unfounded in reality. The fair tension between the scientific worldview and our experience of human freedom is the subject of the present talk. I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I examine a common strategy to overcome this paradox and find it wanting. I then argue for radical non-reductionism. Each particular science captures a certain dimension, but does not provide a complete description of reality. Even taken together, the natural sciences do not exhaustively describe reality and therefore cannot exclude free will. Finally, creation is shown to offer a framework which is both coherent and successful in allowing human liberty to find its place in a world described by science. So first, no freedom in a naturalistic world. If all that there is captured by science, there cannot be any freedom, at least not of the robust kind which really makes a difference for actions. A naturalistic world is, by definition, a world exhaustively described by natural science. It knows only of natural causes and has no place for agent causation, which is governed by reason and by choice. It makes no difference here if the fundamental scientific description is of deterministic or indeterministic nature, because chance happenings do not amount to freely chosen action. What we mean by being free is not only that precedent natural causes do not totally determine our behavior, but that we can decide for ourselves the cause of our action, that we own it in a substantial way. Indeterminism isn't enough, to quote a very famous paper by Karl Popper. The fact that there is no scientific explanation of significantly free action is particularly clear for rational action. Physics, chemistry, biology use methodologies that are unable to capture this aspect of human behavior. The natural sciences do not even have adequate concepts for it. The argument has been run times over, from the time of Plato through Descartes to contemporary philosophers as Karl Popper and Thomas Nagel. C.S. Lewis has given it its canonical contemporary form, showing that reason cannot be reduced to physiological processes. I quote Lewis, "We experience, say, a chain of reasoning, thoughts which are about or refer to something other than themselves, or linked together by the logical relation of grounds and consequence. Physiology resolves this into a sequence of cerebral events. But physical events as such cannot in any intelligible sense be said to be about or to refer to anything. And they must be linked to one another not as grounds and consequence, but as causes and effects. A relation so irrelevant to the logical linkage that it is just as perfectly illustrated by the sequence of a maniac's thoughts as by the sequence of a rational man's." A very influential answer to the paradox of human freedom in a world described by science has been provided by the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. He tried to solve the problem by including human freedom in the realm of noumena, things as they are in themselves. Beyond and behind the phenomena, things as we experience them. Scientific knowledge is only possible of the phenomena. Human beings, qua free and rational agents, are not accessible to scientific description. Therefore, we cannot know, but only believe that we are free. Nevertheless, this is not an optional belief. We would renounce our dignity as moral subjects if we gave up this belief. When we act according to the moral obligation under which we are placed, we are free from scientific determination. In this Kantian solution, the contradiction disappears. The unconditioned does not lie in things as we know them, or as they are given to us, but in things as they are in themselves, beyond the range of our cognition. Kant's answer to the question of how we can reconcile the natural scientific description of humans with their freedom is a special case of what Stephen Jay Gould would later name NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. The conception that science and religion concern domains that are totally distinct from each other. Such a view has the obvious advantage of ensuring that no scientific progress whatsoever can threaten human freedom. But it comes at a high price. It isolates our experiences of being free from all that can be scientifically examined. In particular, such fragmented views cannot address the important question of the interactions between freedom on the one hand and scientific determinations on the other. Noma-like approaches must treat as illusory our experience that the will can have scientifically describable consequences. I decide, of my own free will, to raise my arm, and I manage to do so. And Noma cannot account for the fact that we experience our freedom as non-absolute, shaped by many physiological, environmental, societal influences. In fact, our actions are a continuum between completely involuntary, unconscious actions, like breathing, and deeply considered choices that engage our whole person. Recent advances in neuroscience have shed ever more light on this fact. But it is not a new discovery. Already Blaise Pascal knew it when he contemplated the power which flies have over human thought. I quote, "The mind of the sovereign judge of the world is not so independent that it is not liable to be disturbed by the first din about it. Do not wonder if at present it does not reason well. A fly is buzzing in its ears." But such a continuum, which involves at varying degrees scientifically describable factors and our freedom as morally responsible agents, cannot be understood in a model that has isolated human free action from science, as thus the Kantian distinction between phenomena and noumena, and more generally, any Noma-like approach. To arrive at a truly satisfactory solution, we must go beyond Kant's criticism of scientism, which he attacked under the names of materialism and atheism. Certainly, his epistemology constitutes a real progress compared to naive scientism, which claims that nothing significant exists apart from what is accessible to the scientific method. However, the ideal of scientism is not really dethroned by Kant or other types of Noma. Indeed, they continue to consider that science offers a complete description of the domain in which it applies. Moreover, this domain is generally considered to be identical with what we can know. In particular, it is claimed that we cannot have any experience of something which goes beyond the scientific domain. Noma also typically postulates the causal closure of nature. A more radical recognition of the limited, fragmentary nature of any scientific description is necessary if we want to finally overcome the antinomy. The contribution of science, or rather sciences, to our knowledge of humans is recognized, but it is recognized as partial. Each particular science adopts a specific point of view, a specific method which is adapted to certain questions and leaves others aside. As in a spatial projection, it captures a certain dimension, but it does not provide a complete description of reality. Even taken together, the natural sciences do not exhaustively describe reality and our experience of it. Other than scientific aspects of human experience, including the foundational experience of being able to make choices, must be taken into account if we want to obtain a complete picture of what there is and how we experience it. Such a perspective has the advantage, compared to Noma, of offering a multidimensional but integrated image of reality, which makes room for human freedom without treating it as an alien element opposed to what is scientifically describable. It is true that the natural sciences cannot grasp this freedom any more than the personal dignity of humanity or our openness to transcendence. Nevertheless, such a multidimensional perspective does not relegate the moral or spiritual agency of humans to the mysterious domain of the noumena, as the Kantian solution did. Insofar as the scientific description is incomplete, we can recognize physiological causalities and at the same time consider that human beings act, at least sometimes, freely. There's no need to erect watertight partitions between the scientific realm and the realm of human agency, if only we recognize the partial nature of any scientific description of the world and of humans in it. The perspectives just outlined bear some similarities to the conception which the philosopher Stephen Horst at Western University in Middletown, Connecticut, has developed under the name of cognitive pluralism. It is cognitive in the sense that it takes into account the constructive role of the mind in model building. Our models, in science and elsewhere, are idealized representations of particular features of the world. It is pluralist in the sense that it is inclined to take the plurality of existing models in the current sciences not as a transitory feature, but as a consequence of facts about how the mind models the world. Believing otherwise would come down to the rationalistic assumption that everything about the world must be intelligible to us in the form of a single theoretical framework. Not only does this assumption seem quite hubristic, but also our best available scientific theories do not support it. General relativity and quantum mechanics are inconsistent with each other. Cognitive pluralism takes scientific laws to be idealized descriptions of the real world that highlight the dynamic principles that underlie real-world kinematics. This conception is both realistic, laws are invariants in the real world, and cognitivists, laws are part of our representation of the world. The second trait is the basis for there being multiple sets of laws or theories, because they are part of different representations depending on the invariance studied in a given context. Unless the rationalist assumption is true, our mind necessarily understands the world in a fragmentary way, so that the plurality of scientific models is irreducible. Therefore, we should not expect any particular science, or even the sciences as a whole, to provide an exhaustive description of reality. On the contrary, dynamic laws express potential partial causal contributors to real-world kinematics. Such a pluralist view of scientific laws has immediate implications for reductionism. However successful a certain scientific model is in a certain domain, it does not preclude the possibility that there are other causal factors at work. Take as an example the law of gravitation. It does not say anything at all about the question of whether, in addition to gravitational forces, other causal factors are present, which can be described by other laws, for example, electromagnetic forces. It does not even exclude the existence of extra causal factors, which cannot be described by scientific laws, as would be the case for agent causation. Thus, it is simply wrong to assume that a scientific description of the world necessarily leads to reductionism or includes free will. Horst's characterizations of scientific laws has the great advantage of being close to actual scientific practice. If one accepts his account, the antinomy between scientific description and human freedom disappears. One only needs to accept the fragmentary nature of any scientific statement. In particular, the causal closure of the physical world is not a scientific result. It can only be established in a circular way. In order to see that the causal closure of the natural world is not a result of science, let us consider one common deduction, which concludes from the principle of conservation of energy to causal closure. But the thermodynamic considerations that establish conservation of energy typically ignore situations in which a miracle occurs, or more worldly, in which a human interferes with measuring devices. Thus, the principle of conservation of energy only excludes any external intervention if one takes the idealization inherent in any model as limits to what can happen in the real world. But in fact, the conditions stipulated in the model do not specify what can or cannot occur, but only under what conditions the model is a good model of reality. Therefore, the scientific image of humanity is unmasked for what it is, not a result of the sciences, but a result of scientism, that is, absolutized science, as if science could or should provide an exhaustive description of the world and of humans who live in it. Let us halt for a moment and contemplate what we have achieved up to now. A certain reading of scientific results leads to consider human action as determined by material, deterministic or random factors that do not make room for human freedom and responsibility. Although this conception is based on scientific discoveries, it's not a result of science, but stems from the absolutation of science. It is thus scientist rather than scientific. Kant, and after him any Noah-kind account, seek to save the dignity of man as a moral and spiritual agent by placing these aspects of human nature in a sphere inaccessible to scientific research. However, there is no need for such a dualistic approach as soon as we realize the fundamentally partial nature of any scientific description. Thus, our scientific knowledge about humans does not exclude what we are. In fact, endowed with freedom, reason, and an openness to transcendence. The spiritual and scientific visions of humanity are compatible with each other. But precisely what we have established so far is nothing more than compatibility. Acknowledging the fragmentary nature of scientific descriptions does not ipso facto prove that humanity is endowed with freedom of thought, action, and love. How exactly can we know that humans are free? The first answer that comes to mind is undoubtedly the intuitive experience we have of freedom. Doesn't each of us experience the freedom of making significant choices? Could any argument, whether scientific or philosophical, that seeks to prove the contrary ever be stronger than the intimate experience of being free? The strength of this subjective empirical evidence should not be underestimated. It finds further support by the epistemological suicide, which anyone commits who uses scientific knowledge as an argument against human liberty. What I mean by epistemological suicide? In fact, scientific knowledge presupposes the proper functioning of human reason, which in turn presupposes freedom of thought. Nonetheless, some have tried to deny the evident. Reductionist accounts of human nature, which see it as totally conditioned by material causations, genes, neurons, hormones, environments, are eloquent proof of the possibility to deny human freedom, at least in the context of a philosophical discussion. There are still advocates for the metaphor of man and machine, the title of the polemical book of La Métrie. Thus, it is not without interest to look for some foundation for human freedom, which goes beyond our immediate experience of being free. Finding a metaphysical framework that integrates both scientific practice and human freedom will allow us to tighten our understanding of the place of human liberty in a world described by science, beyond the subjective experience of freedom. And the rest of my talk seeks to demonstrate that the biblical notion of creation exactly provides such a framework. As is well known, creation provides a framework which is conducive to the scientific endeavor, as several of the fundamental presuppositions of modern scientific method flow from biblical theism. As the creator, God is a God of wisdom and order. His creation exhibits order. As he is also all-powerful, the natural order he establishes is universal. Human beings created in the image of God are both able to and called to understand at least part of the created order. Even more specifically, the experimental approach is suitable for a freely created world. We cannot claim to discover by reflection alone what form God has chosen to give to the world. Moreover, the active approach adopted in experimentation is only appropriate in a world that is not divine. Animism or pantheism, for example, are more inclined to contemplate reality than to manipulate it through experience. Abraham Kuyper highlights the grounding of science in creation. He derives the human ability to understand nature through science from the combination of two aspects of the doctrine of creation: God creating by his word, and humanity being created in the image of God and thus endowed with wisdom. Both aspects are traditional parts of the doctrine, but Kuyper adopts rather strong versions of each of them. Concerning the first, creation by the word, Kuyper insists on the rational character of creation. For him, thinking is first in God, and everything created is only the outflowing of God's thought, so that all things have come into existence by the Logos. He insists that the divine thought that causes all things to function in their course is no working without aim or plan, but an operation directed at a destiny and moving toward that goal with stringent rules. Everything indispensable for reaching that destiny has been placed in created things at their origin. Concerning the second truth, humanity being created in God's image, Kuyper answers the question of whether we human beings are equipped with an ability to rethink the thinking of God. And he answered it with a clear yes. This ability of man is a result of his place in creation, not of supernatural grace, an ability not added to, but based in human nature. It is noteworthy that Kuyper considers that this privilege is conferred to humanity as an organic whole. I quote again, "No one brain, one genius, one talent is given the ability to understand the fullness of the word in creation, but all people together have the task of making this comprehension. The scientific task was not committed in its full extent to each person individually. That is impossible. The range is far too great and any person's ability far too limited." Divine transcendence guards against scientism, the illusion that science can explain everything. God being transcendent, he is beyond scientific exploration. And the world being his handiwork also partakes of his incomprehensibility. This theme occurs frequently in Old Testament texts dealing with nature. It does not foster global skepticism, as humanity is created in God's image and therefore shares in his privilege of knowledge, but it highlights the fact that the human knowledge is always that of creatures, thus limited in scope. Quite interestingly, in the history of science, the conviction of nature's incomprehensibility underpinned Newton's empiricism. Humans cannot hope to attain an exhaustive rational knowledge and therefore need to perform experiments in order to see how God created the world. The legitimacy and even necessity of multiple forms of inquiry comes as a consequence of divine transcendence, combined with the creation of humanity in the image of God. Human beings are the image of God, not God themselves. Humanity reflects something of the transcendence of the God whose image they bear. They are part of the created world, created on the sixth day of creation, together with the land animals, but at the same time they transcend the material world. Therefore, any methodology developed to describe non-human entities, which would include physics and chemistry, cannot provide a complete picture of human beings. And in particular, the notion of personhood extends beyond the scope of the natural sciences objectifying method, so that even biology is inadequate for describing humanity in total. Thus, divine transcendence, reflected in humans as the image of God, prescribes scientific reductionism. In line with the creator-creature distinction and the creation of humanity in the transcendent creator's God, Kuyper insists on the autonomous character of the spiritual in us. Otherwise, we would shortly arrive at the denial of the spirit in general and thus of God. The irreducibility of the spiritual to the material has two consequences for the scientific endeavor, according to Kuyper. Insofar, I quote again, insofar as science has to reckon with that independent factor of mind and do so as much in the researching subject as in the spiritual things researched. The former implies the indispensable role of the knowing subject. The latter establishes the autonomy of the higher sciences, which in turn implies non-reductionism. On this point, Kuyper emphasizes that our observation of the spiritual world must always begin with a consultation of our own spirit. The methods employed in the empirical sciences, seeing, hearing, weighing, and measuring cannot stand on their own in this field. Quote again, whatever we see and hear of others would never have caused us to find out that there is a spirit in them did we not possess a spirit ourselves. This implies that the human sciences should not try to copy the methods employed for the study of external things, but adopt a methodology in line with the domain studied. Observation and measurement, though useful, can never function but a servant when it comes to spiritual matters. Kirby laments that this truth has been neglected in modern science, which has led to the increasing materialization of all science, feeding the false notion that spiritual life arises from material causes. Non-reductionism has lately become fashionable in philosophy of mind, but also more generally in philosophy of science. Reductionist models have patently failed to make good on their grandiose promises to offer reductionist, mainly physicalists, explanations for such basic aspects of our experience, such as consciousness, intentionality of thought, and rationality. Different emergentist accounts have been proposed, and one which non-reductive physicalism features prominently. But note that God's transcendence, as reflected in his human image, encourages a more radical departure from reductionism than standard emergentistic models, in which higher levels supervene upon a typically physical baseline. Methods of inquiry developed to describe the inanimate world do not enjoy any privileges over more personally involved interactions with reality. Why try to deduce the latter from the former? Instead, creation as the handiwork of the transcendent God leads to a clear acknowledgement of multiple dimensions. Thereby, the contribution to our knowledge of each particular science, both natural and human, is valued, but any absolutization of a particular science or of sciences taken together is rejected. Non-reductionism is an important element of neo-Calvinist thinking about the world. For his inaugural address at the dedication of the Free University of Amsterdam, Kirby chose to speak on sphere sovereignty. There exist different spheres in the created world, among which are science, family, church, and state. Each is autonomous in the sense that the other spheres must not interfere with it nor impose laws that are alien to it. Because each comprises its own domain, I quote, each has its own sovereign within its bounds. Hermann Dooyeweerd speaks of modal aspects, which delimit the special viewpoints under which the different branches of empirical science examine the empirical world. For Dooyeweerd, they are not distinctive domains of reality, but arise inside the temporal horizon of human experience. He sees the ego as a supratemporal central unity, but human experience is reflected in the order of time into a rich diversity of modalities of meaning, just as sunlight is refracted by a prism in a rich diversity of colors. Dooyeweerd lists 15 modal aspects, which are organized in a hierarchy of modes of experience. In a given context, one of these modal aspects will be predominant, although others will nevertheless be also present. Whereas non-reductionism is a common feature of neo-Calvinistic epistemology, its exact locus vary. For Kirby, sphere sovereignty is crucial in order to avoid the inevitable abuse of absolute power. But the different spheres are not arbitrarily imposed on unstructured reality. They stem from the divinely ordained order of creation. For Dooyeweerd, the different modal aspects are the consequence of the temporal horizon of human experience, thus giving his conception a distinctively idealistic flavor. The difference between these two key figures of Neo-Calvinism is linked to Kuyper's acceptance and Dooyeweerd's rejection of Logos theology. For Kuyper, human knowledge is possible insofar as we are created in the image of Him who has ordered creation by His word. For Dooyeweerd, the antithesis characteristic of Wissenschaft is introduced by the theoretical activity of the ego itself, which is therefore also able to guarantee its synthesis. Thus, in Dooyeweerd, the supratemporal self, the heart, takes on the role that the Logos played in traditional Christian epistemology. Needless to say, given my rejection of the Kantian solution above, I consider a realistic conception of non-reductionism necessary in order to truly account for human freedom in a world described by science. So on this point, I sit with Kuyper against Dooyeweerd. Once non-reductionism solidly in place, let us see how more specifically human freedom comes into play. Creation differs from other worldviews in that it places the origin of the world in the free act of the transcendent God. Creation does not stem from the nature of God, but from His will. The distinction between divine will and divine nature expresses the personal character of the biblical God. Only a personal God can will something into being that is different from His nature. Human action thus finds its natural place in a world born of divine freedom. As the image of God, humanity participates in the power to act of the Creator and therefore in His freedom. Otherwise, they could not stand as a covenantal partner before God, nor fulfill their role as co-workers in the earthly creation. In the ancient Near East, the idea that a human being is the image of a god is common for kings and sometimes priests. But in the Genesis account, the privilege of being an image of God is not reserved to certain men, but characterizes all human beings, all men, all women, without distinction. This constitutes a genuine democratization of ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, and I quote here the excellent study by Middleton. Such a democratization of the privilege to be God's image implies that ordinary humans, and not just kings or priests, are allowed to be significant participants in the historical process. And once again, I quote here Middleton. Human dignity culminates in the notion of covenant, which God concludes with humans. This notion is so central to the biblical view of the divine-human relationship that we have come to refer to the two parts of the Bible by its Latin form, testamentum, Old and New Testament. The predominant role of covenant is an original feature of the biblical religion. Some rare texts from the ancient Near East speak of a covenant between a deity and a king. Gods are also invoked as witnesses for covenants between human agents and groups, so between human persons or groups. But with only one possible exception, there is no known example of a covenant that a divinity made with a human group, tribe, or nation. The faithful relationship to which God commits Himself in dealing with humans over time is a distinctive feature of the Bible. Even Sunni Islam, while taking some of its roots in biblical revelation, does not know of any covenant that God would make with a person or a group of persons. In fact, the idea is hardly suited to the Islamic conception of divine freedom, which is so absolute that Allah does not even bind Himself by His own word. This original trait of the biblical understanding of humanity's place in the world implies an exalted status for us. Certainly, we are not little gods. Biblical monotheism places humans unambiguously on the side of creatures, entirely dependent on God. But we are called to live coram Deum, before God, and in a relationship with him. In order to be God's covenant partners, we are endowed with substantial freedom. Otherwise, no significant relationship built on knowledge, trust, and love would be possible. The exalted understanding of human freedom, which we find in the Bible, manifests itself also in the role which humans are called to play in history. It is noteworthy that biblical proto-history attributes cultural achievements to humans instead of treating them as divine gifts. In contrast to what is found in Mesopotamian myths, where these cultural achievements are gifts from the gods, whereas in the Bible, they are human endeavors. This highlights the human capacity to act and to shape their environment. At the same time, the Genesis texts underline the ambiguity of cultural prowess by placing a significant number of these exploits among Cain's posterity. Common grace, a notion put to great use by Kuyper, helps us to understand how sinful humans are capable of great cultural exploits while not ignoring sin's corruption of everything that it touches. Human significant action in history is affirmed in the biblical history for better and for worse. Genesis 3 vividly reveals the importance of human choices. Humanity is not the victim of tragic conditions that would make evil inevitable. Ancient Near Eastern myths typically explain our experience of evil by making it part of the makeup of the world in general and of humans in specific. This is the case when Mesopotamian myths depict humanity created in part from the remains of a killed deity. Instead of being an indication of a high semi-divine conception of humanity, those myths serve to explain the evil present in human nature. Not only humanity is the result of a strife within the gods, but it is generally created from minor, rebellious, even demonic deities. Not so in the biblical account. Here, evil enters the world by the rebellion of free creatures, who were originally created entirely good. The first humans had been placed before the choice between obeying the command of their Creator and rebellion. They should have resisted the tempter's voice. That human existence is marked by suffering, oppression, and death goes back to the fateful choice made by the first humans. But even after sin came into the world, and with it its share of ills, humans are not abandoned to a fate over which they would not have control. Salvation opens a future that everyone is called upon to grasp, but which can also be refused. At the end of our journey, we have seen that creation offers the three ingredients necessary for human liberty in a world described by science. First, science is affirmed as a legitimate and efficient instrument in order to enhance our understanding of the natural order. Second, the multidimensionality of reality is recognized, so that the sciences only offer partial descriptions of the world. And third, humans are endowed with significant freedom, so that they are able to act and to make choices. This perspective has the advantage of offering a multidimensional but integrated view of humanity, providing space for our freedom without treating it as a foreign element or even opposed through the scientific description. Admittedly, science cannot fully comprehend this freedom, any more than it can provide moral grounds for affirming personal dignity or grasp humans' openness to transcendence. The methodologies used in physics, chemistry, or biology are not attuned to these aspects of human beings. In fact, they do not even have appropriate concepts for them. However, as soon as we recognize that scientific descriptions are always partial, singling out only specific aspects, there is no need to relegate the moral and spiritual aspects of human beings to the mystical domain of noumena. For in that case, one can recognize physiological causalities and at the same time consider that human beings act, at least sometimes, freely. The integrated view provided by creation makes it possible to address the important question of the interactions between freedom on the one hand and scientific determination on the other. Obviously, this does not save us the painstaking work of elaborating multidimensional models in order to understand selected aspects of human behavior and their interactions. Creation provides a productive metaphysical starting point. It is not meant to be the end point in our exploration of the world. Rather, it sets the framework which opens up promising venues for research. Thank you for your attention.